Hi everyone, welcome to the Iconography project in the Material Space and Meaning class at Bethel University. The class, over the arc of the class, I have talked about the projects going from becoming slightly more restrictive to much less restrictive, and I think you're going to find some nice freedoms in this class. You are given a lot of freedom in terms of materials that you are able to use, approaches that you are able to use in imagery. Those of you that have been longing to work in recognizable or non-abstract imagery, guess what? You can do that now. So there's a lot more freedom. Which I think should be fun, but also provide some nice challenge too, because rather than giving you parameters in terms of what you can and can't do, what I'm asking you to do is to maybe move towards specific ideas. So more freedom, and less fences and more targets, you could say, in this project. And so the goal of this presentation today is to maybe show you some examples of iconography and the way that contemporary artists have engaged, specifically religious iconography, to make works that are compelling and interesting. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to describe the project a little bit. We're going to look at some images by artworks from other artists. These are not necessarily artworks that directly are focused on iconography, but maybe a way that I would suggest this is if I gave an assignment to all of these artists and they showed up with these objects, I would say these were really great solutions. And you'll kind of see why as we go and talk about some of these different pieces, 15 or 20 different pieces. Probably one of the first things we need to do in thinking about iconography is actually define our term a little bit. Like, what does iconography really mean? Iconography is a visual image that has spiritual weight. It's something that is meant to, it's like an object for contemplation, or an object that is meant to resonate into spiritual circumstances or spiritual ideas. Sometimes I think people from the Protestant tradition, they look at anything that sort of a visual image that is meant for veneration, or just meant to sort of capture something with a greater sense of holiness. And we start to get super nervous about this idea of idolatry and graven image. That's not what we're talking about. And I would say it is time, if that is maybe a reaction of yours right now, just like it probably was a reaction of mine, when I was your age, sort of considering some of these ideas, it's time to sort of confront this and find some nuance in the way that we think about that, because that is there are many ways of thinking about visual imagery and iconography, and we're going to explore that right now. It's part of our tradition. It's part of the Christian tradition to think about visual images that speak into spiritual conversation. Some of these are very formal, centerpieces, altar pieces that are put in the front of Catholic and Orthodox churches, or icons that are engaged in Orthodox churches. Others, have varying layers of intensity and whatnot. But the first thing we're going to do for this project is actually a little bit of research to understand this a little bit. And then secondly, we're going to start to tinker with this idea of iconography, or just visual images that have spiritual import or carry spiritual content. So that's what we're about. Another part of this project that we're going to be involved in, and this is really the purpose, which is outlined here on this slide, is to think about spiritual meaning in new ways through material investigations. Material investigation really just means like looking around your world and realizing that you are surrounded by an amazing spectrum of materiality that artists use to great effect in a lot of different circumstances. And so we're going to be thinking about this. What does it mean to make something out of one material versus another material? What does it mean to sort of consider an idea or fabricate, maybe like the material languages, the material import, the content that the materials bring along with them into specific works. That is what we want to be considering in this project. So we're going to do, excuse me. First, we're going to take a few minutes and go through some initial descriptions of the project. Then we're going to look, as I said, we're going to look at the work of about a dozen or so artworks that engage this in pretty compelling ways. And then at the end, we'll circle back and think about some ways that you would find helpful, some things to think about that I think you will find helpful in solving this problem. This project has two parts. The first part, which is the iconography and symbol research, which would be a smaller part, take you roughly an hour or two. And then the second part, the making of a physical object, which will be more intensive. And that's really where the heart of the project lies. So you can see that I have expanded to include the word symbol now. Iconography and symbol are quite similar in their terminology, like the meanings overlap mostly. As I mentioned briefly earlier, iconography does tend to be perhaps a bit more associated with specifically religious circumstances, but it also has a slightly different flavor to it as well. There are specific things that are called icons. If you look down below, there's the image on the left is what's called a Greek icon. In the Orthodox tradition, the Russian and Greek Orthodox tradition, Eastern Orthodox traditions, there are paintings that are created in really, really specific ways. This is a Greek Orthodox icon from the medieval era. Roughly that era. But if you were to go into a contemporary church and see a contemporary icon, it would look at it basically exactly the same as this, because they're part of a tradition. They are part of a way of thinking about images or using visual images. In that tradition, sort of looking at the icon is actually meant to be a bit of a window into a spiritual space. I mean, it's sort of literally a glimpse into heaven as you're encountering that thing. The image on the right, which is from the medieval era, so I don't want to say it's Catholic, but it's because there really wasn't Catholic and Protestant at the time when this was made in the roughly early 14th century. But you can see this image here, which tends to perhaps be more associated with the contemporary Catholic tradition. And both of these images would be perhaps examples of like the iconographic traditions within the Christian church, in which the objects that are being made are being fabricated in order to give us glimpses of objects and individuals and spaces that are used for veneration and for prayer and for contemplation and experience. And these are very specific uses of the word, maybe icon. And to think in a larger way about iconography, it really just means, iconography has also expanded in meaning to mean really just any kind of visual symbol that that evokes larger meanings, that is meant to sort of create larger experiences. The first part of this project is some iconography research, and that is easily done on the internet. So just if you're watching this on a computer, you can just take an hour or so and accomplish this. Iconography research, and I use the word kind of symbol and iconography pretty interchangeable in this part of the talk. Symbol and iconography are virtually synonymous, except that iconography really specifically references visual traditions in religious communities, spiritual communities, faith communities, things like that. So iconography specifically is about sort of visual traditions related to spiritual meaning. A thing to remember about symbol and iconography both is that they are completely meaningless without tradition, okay? And I think that there's a really great example. It seems like every Christmas, somebody comes along and says, oh, by the way, it's like you're at a party or something and somebody comes along and says, oh, by the way, the Christmas tree is, a pagan symbol, so we really shouldn't have, like they're pointing out some great transgression or something. It's like, well, yeah, that's part of the history of it, but the meaning of it is, as it's been sort of readopted or reintroduced into spiritual traditions, related to Christianity, it's like, yeah, it's like, that's the meaning now. So that was a meaning at one point, and the meaning has shifted. Certainly it's part of the history of the meaning of this object, but it's not some great big weird secret that Christmas trees have a pagan root. It's like, symbols get readopted and reinterpreted often. And that doesn't mean anything, relative to, it's not like there's some hidden agenda in this tree that's going to like jump out and so be a problem for you. Um, I think you can also think about the Christmas tree also being sort of adopted into a larger consumer culture too as a symbol. It means sort of something else. And so I use this as an example because symbols and iconography are absolutely culturally lodged and fixed within culture. Like that's where they exist. It's a language within a culture. And a lot of us, for us Protestants, and to be clear, when I talk about, I'm sort of generally lodging a lot of my conversation here towards the Protestant community, but I would say I'm not assuming that anyone in the class is from that tradition, and I'm almost certain that there are people from other types of traditions. And so what I would say, for the purposes of this project, just choose a faith tradition that's meaningful to you. So I'm going to speak more about Protestant iconography just because of we're at Bethel, but absolutely, like whatever faith tradition works for you, or just that you're interested in exploring a bit, feel free to go down that path for the purposes of this project. In any case, symbols and iconography, Christian symbols and iconography for the Protestant tend to be actually really quite thin. We got crosses, we got fish, yeah, that's about it. We got nothing else. But one of the things that I love to do, and I think the students really enjoy, is realizing that we actually, as Christians, the history of the Christian community over 2,000 years has a very, very rich history and language of visual iconography. And so what I'd like you to do is to research symbols, 6 symbols and put these in your sketchbook, draw them into your sketchbook, which should be pretty easy. And they should be symbols you're not very familiar with. Document the century and location of these symbols, which is not difficult. So you go, so here's an area, you want a really great area to look. Go back to the Middle Ages because there's so much visual iconography there. At that time, before the Protestant and Catholic branches of the Christian church split apart, there was a lot of visual imagery in the church all the time. And even within that visual imagery, you would find things like, paintings, sculptures, like whatever, mostly paintings, within the church. But a painting within a church where you would see a figure, you would also maybe see at the feet of this figure, you might see a flower, you might see a rose. Well, guess what? In a largely agrarian society, people mostly farmers, that rose wasn't just like a random choice. That rose actually meant something. Like flowers had specific referential cultural meanings, or critters like animals had these like really specific cultural meanings. One of the things that I always like to point out, there are paintings, like a wedding paintings with dogs in them. It's like, well, that seems a little weird. It's like, I don't, we maybe do that a bit now, but you wouldn't think that would become. It's like, well, why is that? Well, guess what? I mean, if there's any creature more loyal than a dog, I don't know what it is. I mean, dogs are just insanely loyal. And so to include a painting of a dog within your wedding painting is a symbol. It's a bit of iconography suggesting loyalty. And so there's just tons and tons of this stuff, even like colors, numbers, plants, animals, creatures, like planets, like there's just tons and tons of this stuff out there. But here's what you need to do. You need to document like when and where these symbols were used. They don't have to be wildly different. You could do, it's like all animals, all plants, all, numbers, colors, like, different symbols associated with different countries. And a curious thing that sort of emerges is that you find that a lot of seafaring communities have Christian symbols that are kind of based in, like fishing. Like literally they look like implements of fishing. Or like people that are farmers have symbols that kind of start to reference that world. And you find that these symbols are really responsive and they're used within a culture. So don't just like draw them, but like a sentence or two about the context that these symbols and this iconography is lodged in. That's going to be really important. If we have an opportunity, we're not always able to do this, but I will ask you to present one of these symbols to the class in a brief and informal presentation, just like hold up your sketchbook, tell us a little bit about the one that you had researched. One more thing about your the research for the symbols and iconography, and that is you got to get to a good website. Okay, there's a lot of really weirdo websites out there that are just completely meaningless. You don't want to blog. You don't want Larry's Book of Symbols. It's like not that. Go to get connected with like formal church history. Get connected with like solid, legit sources. It's not difficult. You just have to vet your sources a little bit. So the second part of this is I'd like you to make a physical object. And here's the project description. You are to alter the meaning of a symbol by translating it into a non-traditional material. I think, when I use the word non-traditional, like, well, what does that mean? The traditional materials in sculpture in particular might be things like, carved wood, carved stone, cast metal, like sort of high-end materials that are commonly used for these kind of interpretive experiences. There's a reason that, gold leaf and bronze and, like shiny rocks, I don't mean that disparagingly in any way, but, like stones that are sort of precious or like really sort of visually appealing. When you're dealing with spiritual topics across culture, the intent is always to use the best materials, the most expensive and ornamental materials. What we're going to do is maybe move into not the other end of the spectrum into the poorest materials, but start to create a conversation with materials that are not traditionally used. So alter the meaning of a symbol by translating it, making it, putting it into a different situation in a non-traditional material. So immediately you got to start to look around at your environment. You are surrounded by non-traditional materials every day. Maybe just think about things that you wouldn't normally see in a church, things that you wouldn't normally see in a situation like this, and that is completely fair game. I'd like you to take one of the symbols that you have researched and then remake it or translate it or reinterpret it into a new material that substantially changes its meaning. And I think perhaps the best way to understand how this works is to look at some of the examples that we'll be talking about here shortly. But to note that this can be confrontational or a sympathetic reinterpretation. And that the goal here is not necessarily to make a big fat didactic statement. I think one of the things that Protestants are very good at is sort of talking. It's like we're like a lot of the things that we do in our, like a typical sermon, you go in, you sing a few songs. I'm not being belittling, I'm really not. But so a typical service is you come in, short meditation, you have some songs, and then there's the message. And we all sort of collectively agree that we might enjoy the songs better, but the message is really where the heart of the service is. And so the message is often a persuasive one. It's very much about analytical ways of thinking. It's very much statements. It's like there really are not a lot of questions that are asked in a typical Protestant sermon unless the question is meant to sort of get you to a statement. Okay? This is very different than other kinds of, especially like Catholic traditions or Orthodox traditions that are much more experiential, where you go in and the goal is to perhaps dwell within that experience. And it's less about making persuasive statements that Protestants tend to do, especially persuasive statements like this is how we should be interacting with the world, or this is how you should be thinking about theology, or this is how to understand this particular passage better. And you find that you go to an Orthodox or Catholic tradition, that those experiences tend to be far more experiential. They tend to be less lodged in specific like language and persuasion. So we're going to maybe explore some of that a little bit more, that tendency, or even go farther than that in thinking about different ways of understanding symbol, different ways of understanding spirituality. I would say, too, that just to be clear about some basic ground rules about this, because when you start taking on, visual symbols, Christian symbols, symbols from other faith, and reinventing them in a speculative way, that can really that often sort of makes people really nervous. And I would say in the purposes of this exercise, we just got to set some ground rules, agreeing that this is a speculative exercise. This is a what-if assignment. This is not a big thing where students are making big fat statements about themselves. And, these are not Martin Luther's theses sort of nailed to the church door. These are people who are questioning, asking questions. And this is the role of artists, is not to make statements, or less perhaps to make statements, and more to engage the idea of experience and question. So that's what we're doing. So we're just going to sort of please We're going to be sympathetic to each other. Things that walk in the door, we're not going to judge. We're first of all, we're going to talk about them. We're going to understand. We're going to have conversations, but we're going to leave that judgmental space outside the door, along with your backpacks and that kind of stuff, because we really want to engage a different sensibility in the course of doing this. So. Okay, so the other part of this, again, it's a speculative exercise, which I've mentioned. We're not necessarily making a personal statement, but exploring alternative possibilities for understanding spiritual ideas. So we'll take a few minutes now, and I'm going to show you, like I said, about a dozen or so artworks and talk about those and how this actually works for some of these artworks. And I think that after that, then you have a somewhat stronger sense of the possibilities and the directions that are possible for this project. We're now going to take a look at a dozen or so artworks by various artists. These are existing pieces that are out in the world now that actually illustrate what I'm talking about in creating a dynamic tension between a symbol and a material. Some of these might be a little challenging, might be a little difficult. That's a good thing in the confines of the art experience and the aesthetic experience. Things that are challenging are often very profitable. Not always, but often very profitable. This first work is a photograph by an artist named Andre Serrano. And back when I used to teach ICA, I used to love to show this image and put it in front of the group and ask people to describe what they are seeing. Invariably, people would talk about how beautiful the image is, the image of Christ, and it's his golden glow, and the light, the quality of the light, down on the Christ, and so on. And I like to start with that, not to trick people, but I like people to sort of experience a piece because then I would describe it. The title of the work is Piss Christ, and it is really what it sounds like. This is, as I mentioned, it's not a sculpture; it's a photograph. This is a photograph in which the artist Andre Serrano took a cheap plastic crucifix, put it in a jar, filled the jar with urine, and then photographed the cheap crucifix through through the urine, and then get this really sort of beautiful photograph. At which point in ICA, people would become outraged, and they would start to talk about blasphemy and sacrilege, and where is this guy? We need to talk with him, and whatnot. This is a difficult piece, and admittedly so, and I do like to put it out in the world, because over the 35, 40 years that this piece has now been in existence, when it initially came out, there were a lot of individuals that had various kind of perspectives on it, but over time there's been a bit of a sifting process. And what's happened is that a lot of the Christian community, Christian theologians, Christian critical writers, people who write about art, have actually really warmed to this piece and come to embrace it in some pretty profound ways. And there's a couple of reasons for that. A lot of the essays that I have read about this piece from those Christian perspectives talk about this piece really being about the humanity of Christ. That, for example, one of the challenges that people find in the piece is an acknowledgement that Christ was a real guy walking around who, at least once or twice had to urinate. And this was a physical reality for Christ, and yet we tend to maybe intellectualize our spirituality to such a degree that we're very uncomfortable with ideas like that. And I think this is very, very true for Protestant traditions. I think Catholic tradition, Orthodox traditions tend to be a little bit more comfortable with, kind of these more intimate physicalities of Christ because of their acceptance of certain theological doctrines, where we tend to perhaps take a much more Western approach, a much more analytical approach, where our spirituality is often intellectualized. And so this piece, which, as I said, does tend to acknowledge, the deep physicality of Christ, is challenging in many ways. I've also heard the writers talk about this being about the incarnation. We often don't think about what the incarnation must have been like to, from God's point of view. And I've heard one or two people sort of talk about how they felt that this piece kind of represented that. In any case, there's a lot of ways that this piece can be interpreted, but this is not necessarily a statement that is meant to be only provocative. And I think that that's a limitation that a lot of the early writers had about this, or a lot of people who are upset about this, is they think that it's exclusively meant to be provocative. It is meant to be sort of, upset us a little bit in the way that, we maybe think about our ideas about physicality and spirituality, or, Christ and physicality. But it's not meant to be, simply that. It's meant to sort of lead us into another kind of conversation. And I think that it does that quite effectively. This is a work by artist Cosimo Cavallaro, um, probably 5 or 6 years old at this point. Another depiction of Christ, of a crucified Christ, that also deals with symbolism and materiality in some pretty compelling ways. What you're looking at here is a full-size mold of a man, adult male, probably about Christ's age when he was crucified. And the artist Cavallaro made a mold of the individual and then made a piece entirely out of chocolate. So everything that you're looking at here really is chocolate, probably 150 pounds, I'm guessing. And it's suspended up in a exhibition space. And this piece came out just before Easter. Like I said, it was probably 5 or 6 years ago now. And this work has, when it was sort of put out into the community, I think that it also garnered a reaction. Again, the goal is not necessarily to make people angry. That's not where I'm going. But maybe what I would say is, at times art finds it necessary to make people angry, or perhaps is unafraid to create a reaction in the service of finding ideas that are sort of interesting, compelling, and expressive, and going to speak to us as humans. Qualities of this piece that I have always really enjoyed. There was a bit of genius, I think, in Cavallaro putting this piece out, right before Easter. Again, it's we as Christians in the United States in the 21st century, we have these traditions. In Easter, for example, we have chocolate Easter bunnies, we have the images of the Christ. How do these two things relate? I really don't know how these two things relate to each other. There's always this weird tension in terms of how these are connected. What is the relationship between these two? And often we just sort of accept their dual presence at Easter without really thinking about it too much. And I like the way that Cavallaro just forces these two things together. So instead of the chocolate Easter bunny, we have the chocolate Jesus, who is ready to be broken, for us, so to speak. And it does break some boundaries. It's a little transgressive in the sense that it tends to embrace humor, even a pretty wry or ironic humor about this very serious subject. But at the same time, I also think that humor is not without purpose. An aspect of this piece that I actually really liked a lot is the way in which this piece speaks into another aspect of Easter. It's like, well, one aspect of Easter is the way in which we kind of have this weird association with chocolate and religion, but another aspect of this is, Easter really is about communion. And my body broken for you. And so Christ at the Last Supper, is there a more direct example of, this is my body, take and eat? I think that this is really it, and sort of the joy of that, or the celebration of that, or on one level, for us as Christians, the gift of that. And I think it does actually capture that aspect of it. And so, like a lot of really great artwork, it has tensions. It doesn't mean exclusively one thing. It can be interpreted perhaps in a couple different ways. And a lot of those interpretations are uncomfortably contradictory at times. The fact that it is a little humorous, the fact that it does sort of make light to some degree of some serious subject matter, makes me a little uncomfortable, but yet at the same time, it's a really sort of wonderful experience. And I find it challenging at multiple levels because of that. Another work that uses Christ imagery, but in a far more subtle way, is this piece by Anthony Gormley titled Bed. Gormley is a British artist, an English artist, who makes a lot of work that almost all of it references his own body in some way. He uses his own body as kind of the model, explores the physicality in the space of his own body. If you look closely at the image, you'll see that the piece is made up of slices of bread. In England, you have this sort of crazy processed bread you get at the grocery store that's almost completely square, and this is the bread that Gormley is using. So you have two very large, loaves, so to speak, in which there's a void in the center, and the void, if you look carefully, you can see that it's in the shape of a human, which is actually the shape of Anthony Gormley. So Gormley theoretically could sort of lay down in here. You could put one loaf on top of the other one, make a gigantic Anthony Gormley sandwich, and he would fit very nicely in there. It's all theoretical, of course, because you wouldn't want to do that, but it's interesting to think about this work, and it's helpful to know one aspect of this to parse out what this piece might be about, or some of the themes that Gormley was playing around with this piece. Gormley actually ate the bread that is missing in these two large kind of mattress-like stacks. And so the bread that is there, it's not that he just sort of left that out, is that he actually sort of got up and ate that bread. And so this experience becomes not just one of describing the physical space of his body, but acknowledging that that the bread actually became sort of energy and became Anthony Gormley himself. And I think this is a really wonderful piece. It's just ridiculously simple and kind of beautiful in the way that it's an acknowledgement of all the things that we eat, and we don't really think about this. But also at the same time, very much like the previous piece that we just saw, the Chocolate Jesus by Cavallaro, I feel that there's a layer in this piece, or an understanding of this piece, that's also about communion. My body broken for you. This one perhaps is even more direct. I'm not sure that Gormley would necessarily be comfortable with that as the exclusive interpretation of this, but clearly there's a relationship there between sort of body and eating, and body and energy. And so this piece has, again, sort of multiple layers to it. I really enjoy the fact that it also works on kind of this very physical level, in terms of physics. We take food in, mass becomes energy, solid matter becomes energy, walking around. I think that that's a very nice metaphor, and I think it's a very nice idea to contemplate. Another work by the artist Cornelia Parker deals with this idea, or the tension between symbolism and materials, perhaps coming more from a material sensibility this time, where the previous ones are perhaps a bit more about specific symbols. This work, I think it's helpful in looking at this work to look beyond the work and see the exit sign just beyond the piece, to give you an idea of the scale of this piece. I don't have exact dimensions, but I'm guessing it's a good 18 feet tall. It's quite a large object hanging in a space, not uncharacteristic of Cornelia Parker's work, that tends to be, she often will sort of hang pieces in gallery spaces, create these sort of floating atmospheric structures. In this work, Cornelia Parker has gone to a site of a church that was destroyed by arson, and she has collected a lot of the charred wood, brought all that back in the gallery, and then assembled this back up into some facsimile of some kind of a structure. I love the history of the material here, and I think that this is maybe a compelling thing to think about in terms of this project. Materials come to us through many different directions and means, and we all are aware of this. We go camping somewhere, we pick up a stone from the place that we camped. It may not actually be all that different from the stones of our house, but it's meaningful because it comes from this location. People give us things that are meaningful, not because we value the thing, but because we value the way that it got to us. And there are many ways in which objects become infused with meaning, become loaded with meaning because of their history, their provenance, and the way that they got to us. Museums are full of experiences like this, objects that famous people might own. And we sort of look at these things and marvel at the way that they're both simultaneously sort of strange and familiar, because they're kind of ordinary in one sense, but they're very extraordinary in another sense. And I think that the provenance of this material, the history of this material showing up as, coming from a church not destroyed by fire, but destroyed by arson, which is important, which is an act of malice, which is an act of hatred and violence. That this object showing up, and this Christian church, which is so much looking forward to resurrection, that it's simultaneously about that. I like the way that the piece evokes both of these things: a certain rising again, a certain sense of resurrection, and also acknowledges the reality of hatred, or the reality of violence. Again, the piece is open-ended. It's not necessarily a clear sort of testimonial, this is what I believe, and this is my big theological statement. It's more of a question. It's like, what does this mean? What does the resurrection look like in terms of, this structure, this time, this space? A related work by Cornelia Parker is this piece titled My Soul of Fire. It's a good example of what happens to artists or for artists occasionally, is that we find things in the world that all we really have to do is to put it out, claim it, put it out there, and it becomes an authentic artwork on its own right. I believe that this piece came from the same site as the materials from the previous work we were just looking at. It is a hymnal, and the hymnal has been charred all the way around the edges to the point that it's completely falling apart. And the hymnal's been opened up. If you look carefully at the top left, you can see that it's been opened to the page titled My Soul of Fire. Aspects of this piece that I really enjoy, that I really like, are the fact that the charring on the outside is such a contrast with this pure white on the inside. And I like the way that the book becomes almost a surrogate experience. I think we've all had excuse me, those moments where we've been through experiences that deeply affect us on the outside, but there is, maybe something on the inside which is hopefully left untouched. It feels very spiritual in that sense. I also think that the metaphor, my soul of fire, or the phrase my soul of fire, becomes a bit of a metaphor, a bit of a question here. I like in the work the way that the piece starts to ask me questions about, what does it mean to be consumed? That in Christianity, a big idea is that we must die in order to live. The idea of being consumed or being used up is a question that sort of lingers in the Christian. For Christians, like, what is the nature of that? How does that really work? To what degree? What is lost and what is burned up, and what is retained? And I think that this piece is just a lovely question that allows me to think about those things. It doesn't necessarily answer those questions for me, but allows me to think about that in my own way, in kind of a personal way. This next work is a piece by the artist Mona Hatoum, who is a Palestinian artist who is mostly a sculptor, but works a lot with a wide range of materials, and is very much about this idea that material sensibilities and material histories are really integral to what the materials mean, and really loves to embrace material histories in her work. This is a large-scale map. I don't have dimensions on this, but I'm guessing, looking at the top of the slide image, that it's probably 10 to 12 feet wide. What you're looking at here are 2,400 blocks of olive oil soap. The olive oil soap have beads that are pressed into them that outline a series of territories. Mona Hatoum, as I said, is Palestinian, and what she's referencing here in this particular work is a set of territories that Israel agreed to give back to Palestine in the Oslo Accords of 1993. And if you know the history of Palestinians and Israelis, it is one where land becomes really a site of great conflict and great tension. And so what Mona Hatoum seems to be suggesting here with the piece, which is large and expansive, is this sort of giving back of these parcels of land. It has some aspect of washing, or there's an aspect of this which is about cleaning or cleanliness, a need to do this, or perhaps a desire to do this, over these contested territories, over these contested locations and sites. And so while the imagery here is perhaps more ambiguous or less direct or readable for us, without knowing the deep and complicated history of these two nations, it is clear that what she's talking about is really creating a landscape with this soap, and talking about the need for some kind of renewal, some kind of washing, or perhaps the washing as a metaphor. I've always sort of suspected that this piece was about claiming that Israel giving back these territories was a form of sort of cleaning themselves of a larger transgression of sort of establishing, the nation of Israel without, in a pretty unilateral way. Anyhow, that's just perhaps my reading on this. But the idea of these large, expanse of soap, I think, is a beautifully stunning object. I think it's very dense and very rich and just really beautiful. I like the different colors that are represented here, just on a physical, tactile level. I think it's a really gorgeous object that speaks well into a conversation that she's wanting to have about the relationship between these two nations. Here we can see a close-up detail of the olive oil soap. The way that they make this soap, by the way, is to literally, because refrigeration is such a big thing, that when they make this soap, they literally spread, mix this up. It's a heat process, and they spread this out on the floor and then cut this up. So these soap factories, you literally just the entire floor of the building is covered in this soap, which is then just sort of cut up and stacked like this. And then the beads, which are pressed into the surface of the soap, is visible here as well. The piece that you're looking at here is by artist Damien Hirst. Damien Hirst is a contemporary artist who does a lot of work using human body parts, animal body parts. That's his medium, as well as a lot of other kinds of ideas as well. Hirst, in this particular piece, started with a human skull. He acquired a human skull of a 35-year-old male from Europe who was born roughly 1750 or so. Surprisingly, it's actually not that difficult to acquire, materials like this. So Hirst acquired the skull, worked with some jewelers and some craftspeople, and made a perfect reproduction of the skull in platinum, which he then had covered with diamonds. There's about 1,100 carats of diamonds here, about 8,600 diamonds or so. They're flawless diamonds, and they cover the whole thing all around. As you can see, there's a very large one on the forehead, which is about the size of a large acorn or a small walnut. And then after all of that process, Hirst then inserted the original teeth back into the skull to give us this vision of, that we're seeing right in front of us right here. The raw materials for the work cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $24 million. Hirst eventually sold this piece for about $100 million. Which is ridiculous. It's ridiculous on many levels. However, there's something about that ridiculousness that I actually kind of like, and we'll see why as we look at the next slide. Hirst's work, the one that we saw in the previous image, is actually part of a tradition, and it's a contemporary tradition that maybe hasn't been taken up much, but back in the Middle Ages in Europe, remember that Hirst he is European, he's from the UK, but back in the Middle Ages in Europe, there was a long history in the Christian tradition of reliquaries, or venerating bones or bones of saints and so on. So a revered figure, holy figure, man or woman would die. They would inter the individual for some time. After a while, they would disinter them after all the soft tissue was gone, and use the bones then to, the bones would be sort of disseminated to various locations, and people could come and they could venerate, pray to, pray in front of, light a candle in front of. It's a votive experience, a worship experience, to be in front of these relics, they were called. And as part of that, reliquaries, which were the holders of reliquaries were created, and some of these were just kind of crazy ornate. And so one of the things that you're seeing in front of you here, the object that you're seeing in front of you right here, is actually a reliquary cross from France at about 1180 or so. It's a silver object with gems. And if you look at not the first crossbar at the top, but the second crossbar in the middle, right in the center, there's a little brown square. In the center of that, there's a little brown thing. And what actually is in the center of that is a little fragment of wood, just normal kind of acacia wood or some kind of a darker hardwood. And it is believed, according to the provenance or like the beliefs around this, that was actually a fragment of what was called the true cross, which would be the cross that Christ was crucified on, which, if you can imagine, that would be just a tremendously holy relic. And so however they came upon this thing, they felt it was a relic from the Christ's cross of crucifixion, and then they sort of worshipped it and created this really strangely paradoxical object where you have thousands and thousands of dollars in materials and gems and jewels and gold and silver surrounding these other tiny little bits of wood that are completely worthless aside from the fact of the maker's belief in the fact that they were actually part of the true cross. So what's happening with the Hearst piece, which again is I'm not sort of claiming that that's necessarily a piece that I want to hold up as the epitome of Western art, but I would say that it's very much part of this tradition of thinking about material histories and how to have a material conversation. How the history of a material can start to inform it, what is meant by different kinds of value. One of the things that I've always really loved about these these antiquated reliquaries, like the one that you're looking at here, is the degree to which they represent and hold different types of value. You have sort of monetary value and then tremendous spiritual value, and they're intersected. And there's such contradiction. There's such funny relationships between these two that I enjoy those. So again, the goal of this in Hearst piece, may be varied, but I would say at the very least we can appreciate the sense in which there's an image here, a Christian image, a Christian tradition that he's absolutely participating in and absolutely a part of as he makes his piece, which is titled "For the Love of God." I'm going to look at a couple works by a Chinese artist named Ai Weiwei. And Ai Weiwei is a very well-known artist right now. He is of a Chinese ancestry and origin, but he really kind of works all over the world and is speaking to larger global causes. Very interesting person who's very interested in issues of social justice. He's coming to this idea of imagery and iconography from a very different place. But I do think that how he regards materials, his material sense, historical sense, is an interesting point of conversation as we think about this idea of imagery and materials. The work that you're looking at here is an Ai Weiwei jar that he had overpainted. The original jar itself was a Chinese object from about 260 BC. Is from the Han Dynasty. And Ai Weiwei's done a number of these objects where he's taken ancient pottery, old pottery, and basically just kind of tractor paint and painted over these, Coca-Cola logos and other kinds of, logos like that as a way of thinking about, from his perspective, he often talks about what China is doing to its sense of the past. Over the past 15 years or so, China has gone through a tremendous revolution in terms of, transforming cities, transforming the nature of where people work, and so a lot of the old structures and a lot of history is literally being bulldozed and destroyed and ruined in many ways. And so that's something that Ai Weiwei starts to explore in a number of his pieces. This one right here, where he more or less desecrates this very ancient and frankly irreplaceable object. It's not like it's the only one of its kind, but it's absolutely an irreplaceable object. You don't just get these, down at the 7-Eleven. And by desecrating it, by painting this contemporary thing on as I would say kind of a prophetic experience. The way that he is looking at what the larger Chinese culture is doing to its own history. I think that's really the conversation here. Another related work that was even a little bit earlier was this piece is in front of me. It's actually a set of photographs, but it's documenting a performance. Again, Ai Weiwei working with a Han Dynasty urn, about that same age, about 2,000 years old or so, where he holds the urn, simply lets it go in the middle photograph, and then the urn is clearly destroyed in the right photograph. In this piece, again, the not necessarily religious iconography, but certainly the material sense or the symbolic sense. There's a strong intersection, a strong dynamic relationship between the materials and some of the images and the ideas that are represented in the piece. And Ai Weiwei in this one seems to be talking about Chinese history and how contemporary China is regarding its own history. Another work by Ai Weiwei, who perhaps expands outside of the range of this assignment, not dealing with necessarily religion, but absolutely dealing with meaning and how materials can become infused with meaning and become really powerful because of their proximity to others, or the materials, the way that they can become infused with the energy of people's stories. He was very taken by the Syrian refugees as they sort of left, and they ended up in Greece and Southern Europe. And images like this, which were very common 2 or 3 years ago, and Ai Weiwei was very taken by this, and so he actually spent some time in Greece and Lesbos and those areas where these refugees were landing. One of the things that the refugees would do is they would sort of go across the sea in these boats, and assuming that they made it, they often didn't make it, but assuming that they made it, the goal then was clearly not to sort of hang out at the coast, but they would dump all of these life jackets and pretty much just walk away from all this stuff and head towards a new life in Europe. And so Ai Weiwei started collecting all of these life jackets and collecting some of this detritus and this castaway materials because he felt it was so evocative and so powerful. It had become loaded with all of the symbolism and all of the power of the experiences that these people went through. Ai Weiwei made a number of pieces subsequently out of the life jackets. This is one that's at a Berlin concert house. I don't know if you folks were politically aware at that time when this was going on, but there was a lot of pushback because of all of these refugees, especially in Germany. All these refugees, a lot of them were moving into Germany, and there were political parties in Germany that were deeply opposed to this. And this strikes a very deep chord in Germany, of course, because of their history with the Jews in the Second World War, and the Gypsies and other people groups in the Second World War, their refusal and persecution and whatnot of those groups. And so Ai Weiwei wanted to respond to that, to maybe make a work that forced people to confront these difficult situations. And so he made this piece, like I said, at the Berlin concert house, where he used some of these life jackets that were left over from the Syrian refugees and just constructed them, put them there. He's done other pieces about the Syrian refugee crisis where he uses materials from those, but this is one that's probably the most direct and probably one of the most charged, given the history of Germany, the reluctance of some people in Germany to take in these refugees, and the particular history of that country. The work that you're looking at here is coming from another tradition, and that is of the sort of Middle Eastern prayer rug. The artist Faid Ahmed has done a number of these. I'll be showing you two, in which he uses traditional Afghani and sort of Middle Eastern, kind of from the region of Afghanistan is where this tradition emerges. But the prayer rug, which is a Muslim object where you sort of kneel on this during the 5 moments of prayer during the day, and you point the point towards Mecca, and then you are praying towards Mecca. Faid Ahmed, in his works, he kind of literally deconstructs these prayer rugs by using the same traditional methods of weaving these things or having them woven. I'm not sure to what degree he does these himself, or to what degree he's borrowing from borrowing the work of other people, but he's certainly having them made. But they are intricately woven, very dense, very finely crafted, and yet they're a very contemporary sensibility. The work that you're looking at right here, the top half clearly is very much the traditional prayer rug with all the images and icons, all of the little glyphs, the little embellishments, the little visual motifs and patternation that really define those prayer rugs on the top half. But then on the bottom half, you have this very contemporary and very much informed by a digital world experience where the rug seems to literally be melting right in front of you. Again, what's actually happening here is this is all entirely a woven rug, but it has the illusion of sort of melting or blurring or changing in front of you. And again, this is another example of religious imagery, symbolism, iconography being directly challenged as a way to get at other more poetic truths. And in this case, I think Ahmed is really talking about contemporary Islam and the way that contemporary Islam is, the traditional values within that culture, within that religion, are being sort of deeply challenged by a digital culture in which a lot of the kind of relationships and other things are really not holding fast. Another artwork by Faid Ahmed, again a woven rug that has been altered. So everything that you're seeing here is woven in a traditional, what are called Oriental rugs, but they're really kind of Afghanistan area rugs. But it's all woven. This is not a computer printout. This is not anything that's been sort of processed by a machine. This would all be sort of hand woven in a traditional manner. Again, we can see this again, distortions coming into play. You have the traditional weaving, probably 70% of this, but then you have this fantastic Technicolor trippiness, almost LSD kind of experience, visual experience in the center, as it clearly starts to become influenced by more contemporary ideas, visual ideas, more contemporary situations. The final artist we're going to look at today is an artist named Chris Martin, who's from Belgium, and whose work is actually would be a good plan of research if someone is looking to find an artist to look at, maybe to explore some other ideas. Maybe you're interested in this topic. But he is an artist who uses a lot of Christian imagery, from crosses, crucifixes, things like that, but uses them in very different ways to speak into perhaps what he might define or others might define as a post-Christian culture. How do we understand Christian symbolism in a culture where Christianity is no longer dominant? And he's definitely interested in that conversation and pursuing it. The work that you're looking at here is titled Altar, and the imagery is pretty specific. Anyone that is studied art history, Western art history in particular, will remember this image pretty readily, and I'll show you where this piece comes from in just a moment. The image itself is put out sort of facing the sea. Chris Martin, in talking about this piece, wanted to think about the potential of this frame, sort of looking out at the sea. For him, the spaces of this altarpiece, and this is the root image, or the root iconography here is of an altarpiece. The images and the panels are always changing. They're always moving. There's a dramatic shift in this piece where the altarpiece that you'll see shortly is one of really specific imagery and iconography. And what Chris Martin has done in this work has shifted that. And so where in one we maybe are looking at historically based images of Jesus and the disciples and the Lamb and whatnot, in this one that he has created for us, we are looking instead at the natural world, and we are finding forms of inspiration there, finding levels of inspiration and peace, perhaps even as he might describe it in this particular piece. This is the original that Chris Martin was referencing when he was making his piece Altar. This is called the Ghent altarpiece by Jan van Eyck. It's very large. It's Chris Martin's piece is scaled to it, and it's a very rich, complex bit of Western Christian art history from about late 1400s or so. Flemish painter Jan van Eyck, who painted this. You see Adam and Eve on the top left and the top right. You see God. You see the patrons down on the central panel down below. There's a lot of imagery, with lambs and kind of very, very dense, thick Christian iconography that would take some time to be parsed out. One of the curious things about these altarpieces is in that time and place, they were not always left open and exposed. They actually are hinged. And so if you were to take the pieces, the panels on the left and the right where Adam and Eve are, you could actually fold those in, so the whole thing fold in just like shutters on a window, which is why they have those curious kind of half moon shapes and moon shapes up on the top. So. The next piece we are going to look at, also by Chris Martin, is based on this artwork. So this is not the contemporary version. This is, again, a classic version. It's actually one of the more preeminent artworks in Western art history. The title is La Couenne. And La Couenne actually refers to the central figure who is a father who is sentenced to a great judgment, divine judgment, sentenced to be punished, for some transgression. Unfortunately, the precise nature of that transgression has kind of been lost over time. There's speculation that it could have been a sexual transgression against someone's wife. It could have been a transgression against deity, against one of the gods for some reason. That is a little bit murky in terms of the precise understanding. But in terms of art history, it's been held up as a really sort of amazing artwork because it's so dynamic. Just not only like physically what's happening, but remember, folks, this is carved out of marble. Look at all of those penetrations. Look at all of those spaces, the negative spaces. The acted, like there's literally every part of this, the surface of this thing, everything is active and engaged and sort of in motion, and the tension, even the central figure of Lequien, look at, like, there's literally every, from his hair to his toenails, every part of him is straining and, in being energized in this torment. It's literally an eternal torment that this guy and his two sons are facing. So. In Chris Martin's version, he has reinterpreted it. This is a plaster version of the original, and what he has done. Take a good look, and you see the difference between the two. It's been a very strategic absence, just like the previous piece that he did based on the Ghent altar piece. This is a strategic removal that really, dramatically reinterprets the piece. Of course, what are missing now are the serpents. These divinely appointed serpents, or these divinely assigned serpents that are meant to attack Lequien and his two sons. So the serpents are gone. And we're left with this vision of the father and the son who are being tormented, but why are they being tormented? It's like, it is sort of, I think a simplistic reading would be that they are being tormented by nothingness. That like the idea perhaps of nothingness is a great burden to them. Unlike the serpents, which are tormenting because of the physical pain, this is more of a psychological or a philosophical anguish. That they are struggling against nothingness out there. It's one thing to be sort of condemned by God; it's another to face the reality of no God. And so this is the perhaps the how Chris Martin has decided to again sort of excuse me, reinterpret the symbol to speak into a contemporary context. It's interesting, not all of Chris Martin's work is about this kind of absence, and these two are actually kind of curious in that regard, but it is interesting that both of these rely on actually very strategic removals to sort of convey, to convey the content, to make these really sharp, beautiful, sort of strange and wonderful objects that challenge us, that make us question, what we're looking at, raise up questions to us that are intriguing and compelling, and things we want to take on. So those are the artist examples. As I said at the top of the talk, one of the ways that we were going to approach this that was going to be different was I was not going to give you materials, I was not going to give you restrictions. Instead, I was going to show you examples, and then seeing these examples, ask you to come up with a similar kind of question or a way of approaching this problem that is inventive and creative, in the way that these are. So obviously you can't choose one of these and recreate it. However, you could, for example, in the last two, Chris Martin, whose strategy relies on removing things, you could certainly borrow that as a strategy and find a context where removal becomes more compelling, or maybe find maybe there was a material sense, maybe burning something, like Cornelia Parker. That would certainly be a valid strategy for moving forward. So another part of this problem that I would like to sort of just lay out there is that I'm certainly available, probably more than other projects so far in the semester. When I get to this one in the semester, I tend to get a lot more individualized questions, where students were just saying, well, Ken, what do you think of this idea? What do you think of that idea? I'm not going to tell you which way to go, but absolutely I would love to chat with you about, different ideas that you have and potentials and construction and how to and where to get materials and things like that. I can be a resource for you, and I would be happy to have those conversations. So don't hesitate to shoot me an email or set up a Zoom conference call or something, or come stop by my office and see me. There are some project guidelines that are, a couple of them are kind of strictish, but they're not meant to, I don't think this is going to impinge on anybody's ideas so far, because we've been looking at some really rich ideas. So the first one is no crosses, no fish, no Bibles, no Christian pop culture symbols like the footprints in the sand, painting. Yeah, we're not going to do any of that stuff. That's just off the table. That's too easy. You got to find some other symbols. There's a very rich tradition of Christian symbols out there, or as I said earlier, symbols from a faith tradition that that is meaningful to you in some way, that you would like to investigate in some way. So please, steer clear of those, dig into some other ones, and it'll be a better time for you anyway. So another one is, if you've seen it before, don't make it now. That's not just including the slides that are here, the images that I've shown you, but images from art history, other things, that you perhaps could find and just reproduce. Let's come up with your own solutions. I think actually it would be hard to research a solution for this, but if something, you might have seen a work before that's like, wow, that could have been a good solution. Yeah, that's great, but don't do it now. Just make your own work. And the third comment here on this slide, we have a few more guidelines on the next slide. Work within your personal tradition, or I would say, your personal area of investigation. This is really not about proving somebody else wrong, or just like that visual tradition is incorrect, and so I'm gonna like make a piece about how that perspective or idea or theological point is wrong. Especially related to like pointing out other people in this era where social media seems to be completely about chucking rocks at other people. It's like, we're not doing that. This is something about our own tradition, our own space, the things that we are wrestling with, and putting that out there, which is going to take a little vulnerability. I would say if you're nervous about this project, that's probably a really good sign. It's like, maybe I would say if you have 2 or 3 ideas that you're thinking about, and this is advice that I give all the time, for my sculptors, it's like, if you have 2 or 3 projects that you're thinking of, choose the one that scares you the most, go in that direction. Because that fear is actually a really powerful indicator of values. That fear is a great indicator of things that are meaningful. We don't become afraid of things, or we don't, things that are meaningless to us do not induce fear. Things that are meaningful have a lot of, often have a lot of tension for us. So, maybe look inward, and it's like, what ideas, as you are considering, what's the one that makes you the most nervous? It's like, go in that direction. I think that actually would be a great way to move forward. Just a few more guidelines and a couple more observations about material, since really the heart of the project is about the conversation between material and symbol or iconography. You can use any materials for this project. And by any materials, I mean literally any materials. You can't use live animals, but you can use like anything that you can bring into the studio. Is absolutely fair game. It does not have to be permanent. We have to be able to see it for the critique. And also the in-process critique, but it doesn't have to be permanent. Maybe you're making something out of ice and it melts, and melting becomes part of the project. Maybe you're making something out of smoke. Maybe you're making something out of grass that fades. Maybe you're making something out of natural materials. And there are a lot of reasons why pieces could be temporary. That's totally fine, and could be a very, very rich conversation. A part of, a bigger goal in here, and we're going to actually pursue this in another project later in the semester, is understanding the material language, or the material meaning of the substances of the things we work with, the world around us. When we choose to, maybe carve a piece of wood, for example. And this is one of the things that young artists discover, like young sculptors. Well, they want to carve a piece of wood, and so they go and they maybe grab a stump from somewhere, and they pull it in and they clean it up, and they start carving that, and realize that they just have a piece of wood that is completely unworkable. That's one idea. But all the material sources that we sort of engage as artists, there's a language there and they speak. And so if you grab a branch, a piece of wood from the backyard, that's a different kind of idea than getting a 2x4 from Home Depot. That's a different kind of idea than, I don't know, what else? Making a piece out of by gluing matchsticks together. Like all three of those are forms of wood, but they all mean very different things. They all have, and by mean different things, I would say they have different associative meanings. And so these meanings, that's a language. You make a container of some type, or you make a box, or a symbol out of ice or wood or charcoal or graphite or cloth or a million different types of fabrics, or these are all have different languages. They all have different meanings, and this is an opportunity for you to dig into that. And so you can look around your environment and suddenly perhaps look around your environment with new eyes. What if you made something? Remember I said that the goal was non-traditional materials. So we're not stone, not gold leaf, that kind of stuff, but non-traditional materials. Like what are the things that you can find in your environment that have associative and evocative meanings? Find that energy, find the sizzle, find the lightning in that conversation and start working with that, okay? Also, we don't want you to explain your work at the critique. Certainly, we're not going to cut you off, and we do want to maybe hear some of your ideas, but here's maybe what I would say is, looking at all of these artworks that we just looked at, does anybody really believe that Chris Martin or Ai Weiwei or Cornelia Parker, or any of these artists had to explain those pieces? No, they didn't. All they had to do was stand there, and the artworks, just people experience the artwork, and that's it. And that's a goal. That's the goal that you should be embracing for this is, let the project do the talking. Certainly, it's always fun to hear people's process. It's always fun to hear things. But what you don't want to do is make a thing and then stand there and say, "Let me explain it to you." No, let the piece create the experience. That's a goal. Do a good job of working with materials. Even the previous ones that I said, things like ice, water, smoke, grass, anything else that you can think of. Guess what? If you work with ice, water, smoke, grass, any of that stuff, that is a craft to working with that material. It's just because you have the idea doesn't mean you're going to get it right the first time. It usually takes a couple generations by generations, I just mean you try a test, see if it works, try another test, see if it works. By the third test, you may be starting to get it. It's do some experimenting to get this thing right. So, okay, that's a lot. Hopefully this is an energizing project. I got to tell you, we have fantastic conversations about the projects that show up. Really engaging. Really, I'm really looking forward to seeing what you folks come up with because it is an opportunity to kick around some very big ideas in a safe context and to find some challenging things to think about. So, okay, that's all. Have fun with it.